On a warm August evening in rural Kentucky, the land rests in silence. The air is thick with humidity, carrying with it the smell of soil, crops, and faint wood smoke. Crickets chirp steadily in the distance, their rhythmic song blending with the occasional call of a night bird. The landscape here is wide and open, dotted with farms, stretches of woodland, and the winding dirt roads that connect neighbors living miles apart. Life moves slowly in this corner of the American South, especially in the mid-1950s, when technology had not yet reached every household and electricity was still considered a luxury for some rural families. It is within this quiet, isolated environment that our story takes place. The year is 1955, just a decade after World War II, and the United States is stepping into a new age, an age of jet planes, atomic weapons, and growing whispers of life beyond Earth. The Cold War is simmering. People worry about unseen threats in the sky, whether they come in the form of Soviet bombers or unidentified flying objects. For many Americans, the boundary between science fiction and possibility feels thinner than ever. Stories of flying saucers had been appearing in newspapers since the late 1940s, sparked most famously by the Roswell incident in 1947, when reports of a crashed object in New Mexico stirred both government denials and public fascination. By the mid-1950s, UFOs were not just a passing curiosity, they were a subject of dinner-table conversation, radio debates, and Hollywood films that filled drive-in theaters with tales of alien visitors. Against this national backdrop of tension and wonder, small farming families in Kentucky lived lives that seemed untouched by such grand ideas. Their concerns were more immediate: tending crops, caring for livestock, raising children, and surviving the hard demands of rural labor. Yet even here, in the stillness of summer evenings, the larger currents of history could not be fully escaped. Newspapers reached their doorsteps, with stories of nuclear tests, strange sightings, and government investigations. The imagination of the nation, whether they wished for it or not, was alive with the idea that the skies might hold secrets. As the sun set on Sunday, August 21, 1955, the fields outside the small city of Hopkinsville grew dark. The horizon glowed a fading orange before giving way to the indigo of night. For the Sutton family, who lived in a modest farmhouse outside of town, the evening began like any other. They could not have known that before dawn, they would become central characters in one of the most famous and perplexing UFO encounters in history. In fact, what they would soon describe to police and neighbors was not simply a passing light in the sky or a strange noise in the dark. It would be something far more unsettling, an ordeal that stretched through the night and would leave them shaken, exhausted, and forever changed. But before we enter the farmhouse and hear the voices of those who lived through that strange night, it is worth pausing to understand the mood of the times. The mid-1950s were filled with contradictions. On one hand, the war years were behind, and prosperity was growing across the nation. Families bought new cars, televisions, and modern appliances. Yet underneath that surface of comfort ran a current of unease. The Cold War had introduced the terrifying possibility of sudden annihilation, and the launch of rockets and nuclear weapons had made the skies feel less safe. In this climate, any unexplained object seen overhead carried with it not just mystery, but also a reminder of human vulnerability. The Suttons themselves were not dreamers or storytellers. They were ordinary people, working people, bound to the land and the rhythms of rural life. Their farmhouse stood isolated, surrounded by open fields and patches of forest, far from the city lights. At night, the darkness here was profound, almost absolute, broken only by the stars above and the soft glow of lanterns within the house. When neighbors spoke of strange events, they did so plainly and without exaggeration. Life in this part of Kentucky did not allow for much fantasy. It was shaped by the demands of weather, work, and survival. And so, when the Sutton family and their friends later described what they had seen, their words carried an unexpected weight. The Hopkinsville Encounter, as it would later be called, is often remembered for the strange goblins said to have surrounded the farmhouse. Yet to appreciate the strangeness of that night, one must first feel the stillness that came before, the ordinary calm of a Sunday evening that should have ended in rest. Imagine the sounds of insects rising and falling in the warm air, the faint bark of a dog carried on the wind, the creak of wooden boards as the house settled into night. Nothing about the scene suggested that history was about to unfold. Nothing warned the Sutton family that they would soon flee their home in terror, seeking help from police, their voices trembling with urgency. This introduction matters because it reminds us that extraordinary stories do not appear out of nowhere. They emerge in specific places, among specific people, and within the larger context of history. In 1955, America was fascinated by flying saucers and fearful of global conflict. Rural Kentucky was not immune to those currents, even if life there appeared simple and unchanging. The stage was set, the world was listening, and on this quiet evening, the first signs of mystery began to stir. As we move deeper into the story, keep this picture in your mind: the farmhouse standing alone in the fields, its windows glowing faintly against the dark, a family gathered together after a long day. The air is still, the night ordinary, and yet, something is about to arrive, something that will blur the lines between reality and folklore, between imagination and fact. It is in this calm, unremarkable setting that one of the most enduring mysteries of UFO history is about to unfold. To understand why the Hopkinsville encounter became so significant, we must step back and look at the world in which it occurred. The mid-1950s were not a time of peace, even if they are often remembered nostalgically as an age of tidy suburbs, rock and roll, and post-war prosperity. Beneath the surface of American life lay currents of fear, wonder, and rapid change. It was a decade where people were simultaneously dreaming of the future and dreading it, staring upward at the night sky with equal parts hope and anxiety. The United States had emerged from the Second World War as a global superpower. Factories had shifted from making tanks and aircraft to producing automobiles, televisions, and home appliances. Families across the nation were moving into new houses in the suburbs, while the baby boom filled classrooms with children. There was, on the surface, a sense of optimism. Yet that optimism was always shadowed by the fear of nuclear destruction. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, shattering the illusion that America alone held such terrible power. By the 1950s, both nations were testing hydrogen bombs far more destructive than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For ordinary people, the idea that the world could end in a flash of light from the sky was never far away. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards, and every strange light above carried with it a question: was it a Soviet aircraft, or something even more mysterious? At the same time, another narrative was taking shape in the skies. Reports of unidentified flying objects, flying saucers as newspapers called them, were becoming increasingly common. The modern UFO era had begun in 1947, when pilot Kenneth Arnold described seeing 9 crescent-shaped objects flying at incredible speeds near Mount Rainier. His description of their motion, like saucers skipping on water, gave birth to the term that would dominate headlines for decades. Just weeks later, the Roswell incident added fuel to the fire. Though the U.S. military insisted the debris was from a weather balloon, rumors spread that something far stranger had fallen from the sky. By the 1950s, sightings were no longer rare, they were widespread, and the Air Force could not ignore them. To address the growing wave of reports, the government launched a series of studies, the most famous being Project Blue Book. Beginning in 1952, Air Force officers collected and analyzed UFO reports, sometimes offering explanations, other times leaving them unresolved. For the public, the very existence of such investigations suggested that the phenomenon was real, even if no official conclusions were ever given. In this climate, every sighting gained weight, and every witness felt that they were part of something larger than themselves. The cultural imagination reflected these anxieties. Hollywood poured out films about alien invaders, giant creatures born from atomic radiation, and civilizations beyond the stars. In 1951, The Day the Earth Stood Still portrayed an alien visitor bringing a message of warning to humanity. In 1953, War of the Worlds adapted H.G. Wells's story of Martian invasion, playing on fears of unstoppable forces descending from above. Drive-in theaters across the country filled with families and teenagers watching stories where the unknown came from the sky, echoing the very fears they felt in their daily lives. Science fiction magazines, comic books, and pulp novels added to the mix, spreading images of flying discs, ray guns, and alien creatures with bulging eyes. At the same time, serious scientists like astronomer Clyde Tombaugh, who had discovered Pluto, reported seeing unexplained objects in the sky. Ordinary Americans could not help but wonder, if respected experts were admitting to strange encounters, how much of the fiction was rooted in truth. This was the climate in which the Sutton family lived. Their small farmhouse may have been remote, their lives tied to the soil and the rhythms of hard labor, but they were not insulated from the world's fears. Newspapers carried stories of atomic tests and flying saucers. Radios brought news of international tensions. Even in rural Kentucky, the whispers of strange objects in the sky reached the dinner table. It mattered little whether the Suttons were skeptical or not. The cultural imagination of the nation was already steeped in the possibility of contact with something beyond our world. It is also important to consider the psychology of the time. Sociologists note that during periods of collective anxiety, people are more likely to report extraordinary experiences. Just as ghost sightings often rise during times of social turmoil, UFO reports surged during the Cold War. The skies became a canvas onto which people projected their hopes, fears, and questions. Were strange lights evidence of foreign enemies, natural phenomena, or visitors from beyond the stars? In the 1950s, all three explanations felt possible, and none could be easily dismissed. The Hopkinsville Encounter would soon emerge from this atmosphere, but even before it happened, the stage was set. America was primed to believe that unusual sightings had meaning. The government was publicly investigating, even if skeptics insisted the answers were mundane. Movies and novels gave shape to imaginations, creating images of little green men, glowing discs, and midnight invasions. In such a world, when a rural family described strange creatures outside their home, their story did not fall into a vacuum. It landed in fertile soil, ready to take root in public consciousness. And so, while the Sutton family could not have known it on that August evening, their experience would not remain local gossip. It would resonate across the nation, picked up by reporters and investigators, debated by skeptics and believers alike. The 1950s had created the perfect storm, a society living with the constant possibility of annihilation, a culture saturated with alien imagery, and a government quietly cataloging the unexplained. Into this world, the events outside Hopkinsville would explode like a stone cast into still water, rippling outward for decades to come. As we prepare to step closer to the farmhouse, it is worth remembering this broader picture. The Hopkinsville case was not merely a family's terrifying night, it was a reflection of a nation's anxieties and fascinations. In a decade when the skies seemed to hold both danger and promise, one Kentucky farm would become the stage for a mystery that endures to this day. The heart of the Hopkinsville story lies not only in what was seen that night, but in who saw it. To understand the weight of the encounter, we must first spend some time with the people at its center, the Sutton family and their guests. These were not celebrities, not professional storytellers, and certainly not individuals seeking publicity. They were working-class men and women, people of the land, bound by rural routines, and shaped by the hardships of mid-20th century life. Their very ordinariness is what makes their story so unsettling, for it is harder to dismiss when told by those who had little reason to invent such things. The Sutton farmhouse stood just outside the small community of Kelly, a few miles north of Hopkinsville. It was not a grand home, but a plain wooden structure, practical and worn, surrounded by open fields and patches of woodland. The house had no running water and no electricity, a reminder that even in the 1950s, many rural families in America lived in conditions not so different from the century before. The isolation of the house is an important detail, for it meant that the family's experience unfolded in a setting where outside help was far away, and the night felt endless. On the evening of August 21, 1955, the house was unusually full. 11 people were present, a gathering that included not just the Suttons, but also friends and extended family. Among them was Elmer Lucky Sutton, a man in his 20s, who would become one of the central voices in recounting the events. Lucky's nickname reflected both his temperament and his confidence, qualities that served him well when the night grew tense. His wife, Vera, was also present, along with his mother, widow Glennie Langford, who owned the house. Glennie was a religious woman, deeply respected in the community, and her sober character added credibility to the family's later statements. Another key figure was Billy Ray Taylor, a friend of Lucky's who was staying at the farmhouse with his wife, June. Billy Ray had traveled from Pennsylvania and was somewhat of an outsider compared to the others. It was he who first claimed to see something extraordinary in the sky that evening, and it was his alarm that initially drew the attention of the household. His report could have been dismissed as exaggeration, but the events that followed seemed to confirm that something was indeed happening. Also present were the children of Glennie Langford, including Lucky's younger half-siblings, who ranged in age from teenagers to younger children. Their presence meant that the night's events were not filtered solely through adult perception. Frightened children added a raw immediacy to the chaos that unfolded. Extended family members and neighbors rounded out the group, making it one of the rare UFO cases with such a large number of direct eyewitnesses. In total, nearly a dozen people would later give testimony about what they had seen and heard. To imagine the Sutton family properly, one must picture a rural household where life was dictated by work and necessity. Days were filled with tending animals, hauling water, cooking over wood stoves, and patching what needed repair. Evenings were times of gathering, storytelling, and simple companionship. Visitors were welcomed, but privacy was also valued, and the farmhouse stood as a self-contained world. The Suttons were not wealthy, but neither were they destitute. They lived as many farming families did, with resilience and a sense of community. One of the striking things about the Suttons' account is how consistent their descriptions remained under scrutiny. Skeptics have often asked why such families would invent a story so bizarre, but the Suttons themselves never sought profit from it. In fact, the aftermath brought them more trouble than benefit. Reporters hounded them, neighbors whispered, and for years the family carried the stigma of being associated with the Goblins of Hopkinsville. If anything, their willingness to endure ridicule suggests that they genuinely believed what they reported. Glennie Langford, in particular, was seen as a trustworthy witness. She was described by investigators as calm, serious, and not prone to flights of imagination. When she said that she saw something she could not explain, people took notice. Her children, too, were clear in their statements, though understandably frightened and shaken. Lucky and Billy Ray, the young men at the center of the defense that night, were perhaps more animated, but their descriptions aligned with those of the others. It is the sheer number of witnesses, men, women, and children, that makes the Kelly Hopkinsville case stand apart from so many other UFO stories. There is also a social angle worth considering. Rural Kentucky families of the 1950s were not in the habit of seeking fame. To the contrary, drawing attention could be uncomfortable, even unwelcome. The Suttons were thrust into the public eye, not because they sought it, but because what they reported was too dramatic to be ignored. Police officers, journalists, and even military personnel would soon converge on their home, turning an isolated family gathering into a national headline. For the Suttons, the night was less about telling a story and more about surviving an experience that felt entirely out of their control. In looking at the family, one also sees the threads of belief and skepticism that run through any community. Some members were deeply religious, framing the night's events as a possible confrontation with forces beyond human understanding. Others were practical, focusing on what they saw and heard, without trying to interpret it. Together, their voices form a chorus that is difficult to dismiss. Even if one doubts the interpretation of alien visitors, the sincerity of the witnesses remains hard to challenge. As the farmhouse grew dark, that August evening, no one inside could have imagined the ordeal awaiting them. The Suttons and their guests were, in every respect, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Yet, in a matter of hours, they would be pulled into a story that blurred the lines between folklore and reality. Before the night was over, they would describe glowing figures at the windows, strange movements in the fields, and a sense of terror that would drive them to seek help in the middle of the night. But at this stage in the story, we are not yet at the encounter itself. We are still in the farmhouse, with its wooden walls, its lanterns casting soft light, and the voices of family members rising and falling in casual conversation. A visitor has seen something strange in the sky, but for now, the night is calm. It is within this ordinary human context, the laughter of children, the comfort of familiar walls, the gathering of family, that the extraordinary will soon intrude. And perhaps that is why the story has endured, not because of what was seen, but because of who saw it, and how utterly unprepared they were for what came next. The night began quietly enough. After a day of visiting and simple chores, the Sutton household had settled into its evening rhythm. Conversation drifted through the rooms, punctuated by the sounds of children moving about and the creak of wooden floors beneath bare feet. Outside, the fields stretched into shadow, the tree line dark and heavy against the summer sky. The air was still, with only the steady chorus of crickets and the distant call of nightbirds to remind the family of the living world beyond the walls. At some point in the early evening, Billy Ray Taylor stepped outside to fetch water from the well. The house, without running water, required these small nightly rituals, and Billy Ray, eager to be helpful, volunteered. It was then, while looking up at the sky, that he claimed to see something extraordinary. A glowing object, brighter than the stars, appeared overhead, streaking across the heavens in a silent arc. According to his later account, it glowed with shifting colors before descending behind a patch of trees in the distance. Startled, Billy Ray hurried back inside, his voice excited, insisting that he had just witnessed a flying saucer. His words drew laughter at first. Visitors to the farm, often teased or exaggerated, and the Suttons, practical people, were not inclined to leap to conclusions about strange lights in the sky. They dismissed it, suggesting he had seen a shooting star, or perhaps the reflection of an airplane. But Billy Ray stood firm, his insistence carrying a tone that unsettled the group. There was something about his voice that spoke less of imagination and more of alarm. Time passed, and the household continued with its evening. Yet soon after, the calm of the night was broken again. Dogs outside began to bark furiously, their growls cutting through the darkness. The animals seemed to sense something unusual approaching, their agitation clear enough to pull the family's attention. Curious but wary, Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray stepped outside to investigate, armed with shotguns for protection. What they claimed to see next has become one of the most vivid and lasting images in the history of UFO encounters. Emerging from the shadows near the edge of the woods was a figure unlike anything they had ever seen. It was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, with a large, round head that seemed oversized for its thin body. Its eyes glowed with a yellowish light, unnervingly bright in the darkness, and its arms extended unusually long, ending in hands that appeared to have talon-like fingers. Its movements were jerky, almost unnatural, as though it were gliding or floating rather than walking. The men froze for a moment, struggling to make sense of what stood before them. In their world, every sound and shape usually had an explanation: an owl, a fox, a neighbor walking at night. but this figure defied such explanations. It seemed to shine faintly, as though reflecting light, its skin or clothing giving off a silvery sheen. Fear tightened in their chests, and instinct took over. They raised their guns and fired. The blast of the shotgun shattered the night, echoing across the fields. The figure staggered, but did not fall. Instead, it seemed to flip backward, almost weightless, before vanishing into the shadows. Moments later, another figure appeared, this time closer to the house, peering from behind a fence post with those same glowing eyes. Again, gunfire erupted, and again the creature seemed to retreat, unharmed by the barrage. By now, the entire household was in uproar. Children cried, women shouted warnings, and the men prepared for a defense. The creatures did not vanish after the first shots. Instead, they returned, circling the farmhouse, moving closer, then withdrawing, as though testing the family's resolve. Witnesses described them appearing at windows, their clawed hands resting on the frames as they peered inside with eerie curiosity. One was said to have crouched on the roof, its silhouette barely visible against the starlit sky. The Suttons fired repeatedly, bullets striking what should have been flesh, but producing sounds like metal clanging or tin being hit. The creatures seemed unaffected, their bodies resistant, or perhaps not entirely solid. Some accounts suggest that the beings floated rather than walked, their legs moving little as they glided across the ground. Each encounter left the family more unnerved, yet the beings showed no sign of aggression. They did not attack. Instead, they watched, retreated, and returned again, as if playing a strange and terrifying game. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew tense and suffocating. Every creak of the boards, every gust of wind through the open windows, felt like a threat. The children huddled close to their mothers, whispering prayers, while the men reloaded their weapons, straining their eyes against the darkness outside. For hours, the cycle continued, shadows moving, eyes glowing, shots fired, and silence descending once more. Descriptions of the beings were consistent among the witnesses. They were small, but not childlike, their heads round with large pointed ears, their eyes luminous and unblinking. Their arms stretched long, almost out of proportion, and their hands bore talon-like claws. They seemed both fragile and indestructible, recoiling at gunfire but never harmed. In later years, investigators would note how unusual it was for such a large group of people, men, women, and children alike, to give such similar descriptions of creatures none had supposedly seen before. It is worth pausing here to consider the psychological strain of that night. Fear alters perception, shadows become shapes, noises take on sinister meanings, and the mind fills gaps with its own imagination. Yet, even with this in mind, the consistency of the witnesses' accounts remained striking. They were not describing vague shapes, but specific features, repeated and corroborated across multiple voices. Whether real or imagined, the beings became a shared reality for those inside the farmhouse. As the night wore on, the family realized this was not a brief encounter, but something more enduring. The creatures seemed determined to linger, to circle, to return again and again. The gunfire continued sporadically, ringing out into the Kentucky night, each shot followed by tense silence. Still, the creatures came back, moving closer, retreating, always at the edges of vision and comfort. Hours stretched endlessly, fear weighed heavily, mingling with exhaustion. The family had no electricity, no telephone, no way to call for help. They were alone in the darkness, armed only with their weapons and their faith that dawn might finally bring safety. What they faced outside was unlike any predator they had known, neither beast nor man, yet undeniably present. By the time the first pale light of morning began to touch the horizon, the Suttons and their guests were worn down, shaken, and desperate. The strange figures had not harmed them directly, yet their persistence had driven the family into a state of near panic. It was then, with children crying and nerves frayed, that they made the decision to flee the farmhouse. They would pile into vehicles, drive into town, and seek help from the authorities. What began with one man fetching water had spiraled into a night of terror that none of them would ever forget. The strange lights in the sky, the small glowing-eyed beings, the endless circling of the house, these would soon form the core of a story that would grip not only Kentucky but the nation. But for the Sutton family, that night was not yet over. They had survived the first encounter, but what awaited them in town, and what investigators would find when they returned, would only deepen the mystery. The farmhouse, a simple structure of wood and tin, became a fortress that night. The Sutton family and their guests had no walls of stone, no locks strong enough to bar out the unknown, only their firearms and their determination to protect their children. After the first sightings, the mood shifted from bewilderment to grim endurance. It was clear that whatever was outside was not going away quickly. The creatures, or goblins, as the family later called them, seemed almost playful in their persistence. They never burst inside, never used brute force to smash through doors or windows, but their constant circling and sudden appearances created a psychological trap that weighed heavily on everyone inside. A noise on the roof would send a wave of panic through the house. A sudden glimpse of glowing eyes at a window would spark a volley of gunfire. Even when no figure was visible, the tension was unbearable, as though something were always just beyond sight. At one point, Billy Ray, restless and unwilling to remain trapped, stepped onto the porch. He later described feeling a hand, or claw, brush against him from above, as if one of the beings had reached down from the roof. The touch sent him stumbling backward, shaken and pale, and it deepened the family's sense that they were being toyed with rather than attacked. These were not animals acting from hunger, nor were they men trying to frighten or rob. They seemed to operate on rules entirely foreign to the human world. The gunfire continued. Whenever a creature came too close, Lucky or Billy Ray would raise their shotguns, firing through windows, doors, or from the porch. The blasts echoed across the fields, each one briefly relieving the tension, but also reminding everyone of the strangeness of the situation. By all normal expectation, the creatures should have fallen. Shotguns at close range are devastating weapons, and yet every report agreed, the beings never died. They fell back, sometimes rolling or flipping unnaturally, then floated away into the shadows, only to reappear minutes later. One account describes a creature crouched on a branch, watching silently. Another tells of one peeking through the window frame, its eyes glowing so brightly that they reflected off the glass. A third suggests that at least one of the beings walked upright into the yard, arms raised as though surrendering or in a gesture of curiosity, only to be met with a shot that knocked it down. Still, it rose again, gliding back into the night. The family began to notice that their bullets seemed to strike with the sound of metal hitting metal, like tin being rattled. This led to speculation, later repeated by investigators, that the beings may have worn some kind of protective armor or possessed bodies of a composition unknown to science. To the witnesses, it was less a matter of speculation and more a matter of despair. If their weapons were useless, then their defenses were fragile indeed. Inside the house, the hours stretched into a kind of waking nightmare. The children whimpered and cried, the women tried to calm them, and the men paced from window to door, weapons clutched tightly. Every noise was magnified. The wind rattling the tin roof, the scratching of branches against siding, the shifting weight of someone moving too suddenly, all became potential signs of another intrusion. And through it all, the crickets and frogs outside continued their night chorus, a reminder that the natural world went on, uncaring of the terror that had settled over the farmhouse. Neighbors later reported hearing the gunfire echoing through the night, though few thought much of it at the time. In rural Kentucky, shots after dark were not uncommon, often used to frighten away predators or as part of late-night hunting. Yet for the Sutton family, each shot was a desperate act of survival, their only answer to the glowing-eyed figures that refused to leave. Psychologists who later studied the case often remarked on the toll such an ordeal could take on the human mind. Fear sustained over hours becomes a heavy burden, leading to exhaustion, disorientation, and sometimes even hallucinations. but the Suttons insisted that what they saw was no illusion. Each family member, along with their guests, provided consistent descriptions. The children, too young to invent such details, spoke of little men with big eyes, who tapped at the windows and roof. Their innocence added weight to the story, for it seemed unlikely that so many witnesses could concoct identical lies under such strain. At times the beings seemed almost curious, their behavior less threatening than inquisitive. They did not smash their way inside, did not use violence, but lingered as though observing. The family speculated nervously about their motives. Were they scouts, testing human reactions? Were they simply lost, trying to communicate in ways the humans could not understand? Or were they something more sinister, feeding on fear, savoring the chaos they created? No answers came, only the unending cycle of approach and retreat. Midnight passed. The air grew heavier, the night deeper, and the family more exhausted. They had not eaten since supper, and fatigue settled in with a dull ache, yet no one dared rest. Even closing their eyes felt dangerous, for the creatures might strike at any moment. They huddled together, whispering prayers, their faith as much a shield as their weapons. Some accounts suggest that at one point, one of the beings was seen almost fully entering the home, reaching through a window before being repelled by gunfire. Others mention claw marks, or impressions left on the siding, though physical evidence was scarce. The lack of solid proof would later haunt the case, but in that moment, proof was less important than survival. What struck investigators later was the endurance of the event. Most UFO encounters of the era lasted minutes, perhaps an hour at most. Lights were seen, strange shapes glimpsed, and then they were gone. But here, the siege lasted for hours, from just after sundown until well past 2 or 3 in the morning. The family remained under pressure, the beings refusing to vanish completely. This persistence made the case unique, not a fleeting story, but a drawn-out ordeal. As dawn approached, exhaustion gave way to decision. The family realized they could not endure much longer without help. The creatures were still outside, still circling, though less frequently now, as if retreating with the night. The Suttons and their guests gathered the children, packed into their vehicles, and fled into town. Their destination was the Hopkinsville police station, a place where, they hoped, sanity and protection might still exist. When they arrived, their appearance shocked the officers. Pale, shaken, wide-eyed, the adults carried the weight of their terror plainly. The children clung tightly to their mothers, still whispering about goblins in the windows. These were not pranksters laughing at a joke or drunks spinning tall tales. These were people in genuine distress. Their story spilled out, disjointed but consistent. Strange lights, little men, glowing eyes, gunfire, and hours of fear. For the Suttons, the siege had ended with their escape. But for the town of Hopkinsville, the story was only beginning. Soon, police officers, military personnel, and curious neighbors would return to the farmhouse to see for themselves what had happened. The aftermath would bring both skepticism and belief, ridicule and fascination, but for those who lived it, nothing could erase the memory of that long night when the goblins came. When the Sutton family and their guests arrived at the Hopkinsville police station in the early hours of August 22, 1955, they looked like people who had endured a nightmare. Their clothing was disheveled, their eyes wide with exhaustion, and their voices carried a frantic urgency that few officers could ignore. They spoke over one another, describing glowing-eyed creatures, strange movements in the night, and hours of relentless fear. To the officers on duty, the story sounded outlandish, yet the sincerity of the witnesses was undeniable. These were not strangers to the town. The Suttons were known locally, a hard-working though somewhat rough-edged family, and they had little to gain from inventing such an elaborate tale. Within minutes, the story had drawn attention inside the station. The Hopkinsville police chief, Russell Greenwell, later recalled that he had never seen a group of people in such a state of genuine terror. He admitted he could not take their words lightly. Skeptical though he was, he recognized that something extraordinary had happened, even if the details defied belief. Deciding the situation warranted immediate attention, Greenwell assembled a group of officers to investigate. By the time the convoy of law enforcement vehicles arrived at the Sutton farmhouse, it was nearing 4 o'clock in the morning. Police cars pulled up alongside county sheriff's vehicles, their headlights cutting through the dark Kentucky fields. The farm, which only hours before had been a site of chaos and fear, now stood silent beneath the fading stars. Crickets continued their song, and the first faint hints of dawn began to touch the horizon. Officers spread out, flashlights in hand, scanning the area for signs of intrusion. They looked for footprints, broken windows, or any trace of the beings the family described. What they found was puzzling but inconclusive. Shell casings and bullet holes littered the property, evidence of the heavy gunfire reported. A window screen bore the clear mark of a close-range shotgun blast. Yet despite the abundance of bullets fired, no bodies, blood, or tangible evidence of the creatures themselves was present. One officer reported seeing a strange glow in the woods, described as similar to the phosphorescent shimmer of foxfire, a natural bioluminescence found in decaying wood. Others noted claw-like scratches on the porch railing and roof, though whether these were fresh or long-standing was uncertain. The Suttons insisted these marks were new, made by the clawed hands of the beings. Investigators, however, could not confirm this. As the officers questioned family members, their accounts remained steady. Each described the creatures in similar terms: small with oversized heads, large glowing eyes, long arms, and talon-like fingers. The consistency across multiple witnesses impressed some of the investigators, particularly since the group included both adults and children. Still, skeptics among the officers leaned toward alternative explanations, perhaps owls startled in the night, perhaps the excitement of one witness, sparking a chain reaction of fear among the rest. Interestingly, neighbors had also reported unusual activity. A few recalled hearing the distant crack of gunfire throughout the night, though they had assumed it was ordinary hunting or farm defense against animals. Others mentioned seeing odd lights in the sky, though these recollections were vague and easily attributed to shooting stars or passing planes. No one else claimed to see the small beings directly, leaving the Suttons and their guests as the only eyewitnesses. As dawn fully broke, the officers completed their search, their conclusions mixed. Some were convinced the family had truly encountered something beyond explanation, while others quietly dismissed it as hysteria fueled by fear, isolation, and too many hours in the dark. Yet none could deny that the Suttons were deeply shaken, and that their sincerity rang true, even if the details were difficult to accept. Before leaving, Chief Greenwell reassured the family that their claims would be taken seriously. He cautioned them to remain calm, but he also admitted privately that he could not explain away what they had described. The police, however, had no evidence to pursue further action. There was no crime, no intruder to arrest, and no body to examine. All they could do was file their reports and return to town, leaving the Suttons once again in their farmhouse. For the family, this was perhaps the most unsettling part of all. The police had come, had searched, and had left, but the mystery remained unsolved. With daylight, the goblins, or whatever they were, had disappeared, but the fear lingered. The memory of glowing eyes at the windows, the sound of bullets striking tin-like bodies, and the endless circling of the house had burned itself into their minds. Sleep was impossible, rest elusive. They waited, wondering if the night would bring the beings back again. Word of the encounter spread quickly through Hopkinsville and beyond. By morning, rumors filled the town. Some spoke of little green men attacking a farmhouse, while others laughed at the thought of goblins in Kentucky. Reporters began arriving, eager to capture the story for newspapers, hungry for strange tales during the height of the UFO craze. The Sutton farm, once an ordinary rural homestead, became the center of a storm of attention. Military personnel from nearby Fort Campbell were also drawn into the affair. Reports suggest that Air Force officers briefly investigated, though their official conclusions, if any, were never fully disclosed. This was the 1950s, after all, a time when UFO sightings were under intense scrutiny by Project Blue Book, the U.S. government's official study of unidentified flying objects. The Hopkinsville case, as it became known, soon found its way into those files, categorized but never fully explained. For skeptics, the case was an example of mass hysteria. The combination of isolation, unusual lights in the sky, and overactive imaginations had, in their view, produced a night of mistaken perceptions. The goblins, they argued, were likely great horned owls, their reflective eyes and winged movements, exaggerated by fear and gunfire. For believers, however, the story was far too consistent, too detailed, and too sincere to dismiss so easily. How could so many witnesses, including children, describe the same strange beings without some kernel of truth? The immediate aftermath left the Sutton family caught between these two worlds. On one side, they faced ridicule and doubt. On the other, they were held up as witnesses to one of the strangest and most compelling encounters in UFO history. For the family themselves, the truth was simple: they had seen something extraordinary, something that could not be explained by owls or imagination. And though they wished only for peace and normalcy, their lives would never be the same. As the sun climbed higher that day, the Suttons sat together, weary and wary, watching the woods and skies. The creatures had vanished with the night, but the memory remained sharp and unshakable. The police could file their reports, the newspapers could spin their headlines, but for those who lived it, the siege was real. The encounter had ended, yet the mystery had only just begun. In the days following the Hopkinsville encounter, the story quickly grew beyond the walls of the Sutton farmhouse. Newspapers latched onto the tale of little green men terrorizing a Kentucky family. Though it is important to note that none of the Suttons ever used the phrase green. They described the beings as silver or metallic, perhaps with a faint glow. Yet the press found the image of green goblins irresistible. From the start then, the case was shaped not only by eyewitness testimony, but also by the imagination of the public. As the legend spread, so did the theories, some skeptical, others extraordinary. The most common explanation offered by skeptics was that the Suttons and their guests had mistaken great horned owls for alien creatures. Great horned owls are nocturnal hunters, large in size with wingspans up to 5 feet, and their eyes reflect a vivid yellow glow when struck by light. They are known to swoop silently and aggressively when defending their nests, and their ear tufts could easily be mistaken for pointed ears in poor lighting. For some investigators, this explanation seemed tidy. Owls startled by gunfire and activity, combined with a long, fearful night, produced the impression of goblin-like beings circling the house. Supporters of the owl theory pointed to specific details. The metallic sound, described when bullets struck the creatures, might have been the noise of shots ricocheting off trees, fences, or even the farmhouse siding. The floating or gliding movements could have been owls taking flight and perching again, and the large eyes peering through windows matched the reflective gaze of birds caught in flashlight beams. From a distance, in a state of panic, owls could indeed appear uncanny. Yet many researchers remained unsatisfied with this explanation. For one thing, the Suttons were country people, familiar with local wildlife. They raised chickens, hunted, and spent their lives in close contact with the land. Owls were not strangers to them. Could so many witnesses, including children, all mistake ordinary birds for creatures with long arms, claw-like hands, and glowing bodies? Even more puzzling, the beings were described as resisting gunfire in ways no bird could survive. Owls struck by shotguns at close range would not simply float away unharmed. Another skeptical theory suggested that the entire event was a hoax. Perhaps, some argued, the Suttons concocted the story for attention or financial gain. After all, UFOs were a hot topic in the 1950s, and newspapers were eager for sensational stories. But this theory faced problems of its own. The Suttons never sought money, and in fact, they appeared irritated by the flood of curiosity seekers and journalists who later descended on their farm. They charged no admission, sold no rights to their story, and gained little beyond ridicule. If this was a hoax, it was a remarkably unrewarding one. A more nuanced skeptical view pointed to psychological factors. Fear, suggestion, and group dynamics can create powerful shared experiences. One person, in this case Billy Ray, sees a light in the sky and insists it was a flying saucer. Hours later, in a tense atmosphere with children crying and dogs barking, others may begin to interpret shadows and noises as threats. Over time, the group convinces itself of a shared narrative. This phenomenon, sometimes called collective delusion or mass hysteria, has been studied in schools, workplaces, and entire towns. In extreme cases, whole communities have believed they were under attack when in reality, no physical threat existed. Could the Sutton farmhouse have become such a stage for the human mind under pressure? Still, the consistency of the descriptions complicates this view. The witnesses described not vague shadows, but very specific figures: large heads, glowing eyes, long arms, and clawed hands. The children repeated these details independently, which made psychologists hesitate to dismiss the case as mere hysteria. Mass delusion can explain shared fear, but not always shared detail at that level of precision. For believers in the paranormal, the Hopkinsville case remains one of the strongest examples of a genuine close encounter. Some UFO researchers placed it within the framework of alien visitation. The glowing object seen earlier by Billy Ray was interpreted as a landed craft, and the small beings were its occupants, exploring or perhaps studying the farmhouse before returning to their ship. Their resistance to bullets was seen as evidence of advanced technology, either protective suits or bodies made of material unknown to science. The strange, playful behavior of circling and peering inside windows suggested curiosity rather than aggression, as though the beings were gathering information on human life. Others took the theories in more esoteric directions. Some argued that the creatures were not extraterrestrial at all but interdimensional, slipping into our world briefly before vanishing again. Their unusual movements and seeming invulnerability fit with reports from other paranormal cases, where entities appear to operate by rules outside of known physics. Still others linked the event to folklore. Kentucky, like much of rural America, has long traditions of goblin and spirit stories. Could the Suttons have encountered not aliens but a modern manifestation of age-old beings that local folklore already hinted at? Interestingly, folklorists later pointed out how similar the Sutton creatures were to older tales of fairies and goblins. In European and Appalachian traditions, small humanoid figures with glowing eyes, mischievous behavior, and resistance to human weapons are common. Often these beings were described as haunting lonely houses at night, peering through windows, and frightening families without ever causing physical harm. The parallels between those legends and the Hopkinsville Encounter are striking, leading some to suggest that the witnesses tapped into a deep cultural archetype rather than meeting literal beings from space. The U.S. Air Force, through Project Blue Book, logged the case, but offered little in the way of public explanation. Their files listed it as unidentified, though unofficially some officers echoed the owl theory. To this day, no definitive official statement has been made that resolves the mystery. The ambiguity has allowed the case to live on, suspended between competing theories. For the Suttons themselves, the debates mattered less than the memory of that night. Whether owls, hoax, hysteria, or aliens, they were certain of what they had seen. Their lives were disrupted, not only by the encounter, but by the public response. Strangers visited their farm, sometimes trespassing, often mocking. Reporters camped outside. Skeptics ridiculed them in print. Believers praised them as witnesses to history. For a family that wanted nothing more than peace, the aftermath was nearly as difficult as the night itself. Looking back, it is clear that no single explanation satisfies everyone. Skeptics continue to argue for owls and psychology, while UFO researchers point to the consistency of the reports and the strange physical details that resist natural explanations. Folklorists highlight the deep cultural echoes of goblin stories. Each perspective offers part of the truth, yet none can claim the whole. The Kelly, Hopkinsville case remains, even after decades of study, a mystery balanced delicately between the ordinary and the extraordinary. As the sun set on August 22nd, and the farm returned to uneasy quiet, the world beyond was just beginning to take notice. Explanations multiplied, theories flourished, but the heart of the story, one farmhouse, one family, and a long night of fear, remained untouched. Whether the beings were owls, aliens, spirits, or something else entirely, their legacy endures in the questions they left behind, questions that may never be answered with certainty. The Kelly, Hopkinsville encounter did not end when the sun rose over the Kentucky fields. In many ways, it was only the beginning. For the Sutton family, the night of fear became a permanent memory etched into their lives. But for the wider world, the story quickly grew into something larger, part of a cultural fabric that connected UFO sightings, folklore, and popular imagination. What unfolded in the weeks and years after would ensure that this event was never just a private ordeal. It became legend. Newspapers carried the story across Kentucky within a day. Headlines played up the most dramatic details, often adding embellishments that the family themselves had never claimed. Reporters wrote of little green men, even though the witnesses had consistently described the beings as silvery or metallic, with glowing yellow eyes. The color green, however, had long been associated with goblins and fairy folk in folklore. Once a journalist planted the phrase into the narrative, it stuck. From that point onward, whenever people thought of alien visitors, they pictured small green figures, a direct inheritance from the Kelly, Hopkinsville reports. This transformation of eyewitness accounts into folklore shows how stories evolve in the public imagination. What begins as a terrifying night for one family can, through repetition and exaggeration, become a symbol for something much larger. The Suttons' goblins were never green in their memory, but the world adopted them that way. The case provided a face, or at least a silhouette, for the unknown, small humanoid, curious, mischievous, and resistant to ordinary weapons. The term little green men quickly entered the cultural lexicon. It appeared in newspapers, comic strips, and eventually in radio programs and television. Though earlier UFO reports had described tall beings or mysterious figures in luminous suits, after 1955, the image of small green-skinned creatures with large eyes became the shorthand for alien life. This shift is significant, for it demonstrates how folklore and media shape what people expect to see in the sky. When children drew aliens in school, they drew little green men. When cartoons joked about visitors from space, they were green. In effect, the Kelly, Hopkinsville event gave birth to a new archetype. Locally, the cultural impact was complicated. On one hand, Hopkinsville became famous. The town's name was suddenly linked with UFO lore, studied by researchers, mentioned in books, and visited by enthusiasts. On the other hand, the Suttons and their neighbors often felt burdened by the attention. Reporters trampled their farm, tourists came looking for the Goblin house, and ridicule followed them. The family repeatedly stated that they wished the event had never happened, for it brought them little more than stress and unwanted notoriety. Yet the story refused to fade. Over time, the encounter inspired not only media attention, but also organized cultural recognition. Hopkinsville eventually embraced its role in UFO history by creating events and festivals that celebrated the anniversary of the incident. Known today as the Kelly Little Green Men Days, the festival attracts thousands of visitors each year. Vendors sell goblin-themed merchandise, musicians perform, and lectures recount the strange night of 1955. What once was a source of fear and ridicule has become, for the town, a source of identity and even pride. In this way, the goblins became folklore heroes, woven into local tradition. Beyond Kentucky, the cultural ripples extended into popular media. The little green men trope appeared in science fiction magazines of the late 1950s, in pulp novels, and in films that depicted alien invaders not as grand cosmic beings but as smaller, stranger figures, with curious, sometimes comical traits. Shows like The Twilight Zone, and later The X-Files, built upon the legacy of cases like Kelly, Hopkinsville, blending fear with wonder, skepticism with mystery. The encounter also influenced serious UFO research. Investigators cited it as one of the earliest and clearest examples of a close encounter of the third kind, where humans reported direct interaction with non-human entities. Decades later, when Dr. J. Allen Hynek developed his famous classification system for UFO experiences, cases like Hopkinsville helped define the boundaries of what such encounters could mean. Researchers pointed out the longevity of the event. It lasted hours rather than minutes, and the number of witnesses involved. Unlike fleeting sightings in the sky, this was a prolonged ordeal with multiple consistent testimonies. For believers, it stood as one of the strongest cases of its kind. Folklorists, too, found the case irresistible. They noted how closely the Suttons' descriptions aligned with traditional goblin and fairy stories. Small creatures emerging at night, peering through windows, immune to weapons, frightening families but never outright harming them. These motifs echoed centuries-old tales from Europe and Appalachia. In this view, the Kelly, Hopkinsville beings were not aliens at all, but modern incarnations of much older myths, filtered through the lens of 20th century fascination with flying saucers. The story revealed how deeply human culture shapes the unknown, giving familiar forms to strange experiences. Even the language of ridicule, the jokes and cartoons that emerged in the aftermath, show how the encounter became embedded in culture. For decades after, skeptics mocked UFO believers by mentioning little green men, dismissing them with a smile or laugh. The phrase became shorthand for the absurd, even as it also symbolized mystery. That dual legacy, both ridicule and fascination, speaks to the power of the case. For the Sutton family, this cultural explosion was a double-edged sword. They insisted they had told the truth, yet they were painted as either the originators of a joke or the victims of mass hysteria. Their farm became part of folklore, whether they liked it or not. Generations later, descendants of the family have occasionally spoken out, reminding the world that behind the myth lay real people who endured a night of terror. The wider UFO community, however, embraced the case as a cornerstone. Books, documentaries, and lectures still analyze the encounter, often calling it one of the most compelling unexplained events in American history. Some researchers argue that it marks the birth of the modern alien archetype. Before 1955, UFO occupants were often described as tall, humanoid, even human-like. After Hopkinsville, the little green man became the dominant image, shaping how millions of people worldwide imagined extraterrestrials. This cultural transformation demonstrates how folklore evolves. A single event, filtered through eyewitness memory, press exaggeration, and public imagination, can change the symbols a society uses to talk about mystery. For the Suttons, the beings were silver goblins. For the world, they became green aliens. In time, they turned into cartoon mascots, comic book villains, and science fiction protagonists. From fear to folklore, from ridicule to festival, the Kelly, Hopkinsville encounter traveled the full arc of cultural adaptation. And so, when people today picture an alien small green large-eyed curious, they are unknowingly drawing from a warm Kentucky night in 1955, a farmhouse surrounded, a family terrified, and the world forever changed by the tale of goblins in the dark. The decades that followed the Kelly, Hopkinsville encounter ensured that the story never truly faded into obscurity. For researchers, skeptics, and enthusiasts, it remained one of the most tantalizing cases in UFO history. Too detailed to dismiss easily, yet too strange to fully accept without question. As time moved on, new generations of investigators returned to the Sutton farmhouse, combed through witness testimonies, and debated whether the mysterious goblins were truly beings from another world, misidentified animals, or something far stranger than either possibility. In the 1960s and 1970s, the case began attracting the attention of more systematic UFO researchers. Organizations like NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and CUFOS, Center for UFO Studies, cataloged it as a significant example of a close encounter. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who served as a consultant to the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book, listed the Hopkinsville incident as an illustrative case of what he would later call a close encounter of the third kind, a direct interaction with non-human entities. What made the event so notable in Hynek's system was not simply that lights were seen in the sky, but that multiple credible witnesses described extended contact with physical beings over several hours. To this day, few cases carry that weight of prolonged multi-person testimony. In the 1970s and 80s, as the UFO phenomenon became part of broader cultural discussions, folklorists and psychologists also revisited the case. Scholars pointed out that the Suttons' descriptions bore a striking resemblance to older European and Appalachian folklore about goblins, fairies, and night visitors. The creatures' glowing eyes, their elusiveness, and their imperviousness to bullets all echoed motifs from centuries-old tales. This raised the question, were the Suttons experiencing something genuinely extraterrestrial, or were they interpreting a strange event through the lens of deep-rooted cultural archetypes? In this interpretation, the beings were not aliens at all, but manifestations of a long mysterious thread of human experience that reappears across cultures in different guises. Skeptics, meanwhile, offered a range of explanations. The most popular theory suggested that the Suttons had encountered great horned owls. These large birds, with their glowing yellow eyes, silent flight, and aggressive territorial behavior, could conceivably match parts of the family's description. Owls perched on branches might have appeared as humanoid figures, especially under conditions of fear and dim lighting. Their wings could be mistaken for arms, their talons for claws, and their reflective eyes for glowing orbs. Critics argued that the family, already spooked by strange lights in the sky, may have misinterpreted ordinary owls as something more sinister. Yet, as researchers often note, the owl theory has its weaknesses. The Suttons described metallic, silver-like bodies and creatures that seemed to float or hover rather than fly. The entities reportedly withstood close-range gunfire without injury, and their movements, darting toward the house, peering into windows, climbing onto the roof, do not align easily with owl behavior. Moreover, the sheer number of witnesses, all describing the same beings, makes the explanation less tidy than skeptics suggest. For believers, the owl hypothesis fails to capture the depth of the family's fear and the richness of their detailed accounts. Other explanations emerged as well. Some suggested that the family had simply invented the story for attention, perhaps influenced by the rising popularity of UFO tales in the 1950s. But this too seems difficult to support. The Suttons never sought money or fame, and in fact, they appeared distressed by the media circus that followed. They often shunned interviews, and when they did speak, their accounts remained consistent over time. To fabricate such a complex tale, involving multiple family members and friends, without anyone breaking ranks or confessing to a hoax, would have required remarkable coordination. And for what gain? The Suttons experienced ridicule, not reward. Through the 1980s and 90s, paranormal researchers increasingly linked the Hopkinsville case to broader themes in ufology. The rise of the alien abduction narrative, with stories of small gray beings entering homes at night, bore a striking resemblance to what the Suttons described decades earlier. Some investigators suggested that the Kelly Goblins were precursors to the Greys, or perhaps variations of the same phenomenon, filtered through cultural perception. Others speculated that what the family experienced was interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial, that the beings were not visitors from another planet, but intrusions from a parallel reality, brushing against our own. Modern technological advances have also allowed investigators to revisit the case with new tools. Digital archives of newspaper reports, government documents, and interviews have made it easier to cross-check details. Audio recordings of interviews with surviving witnesses preserve the sincerity and conviction in their voices. Some UFO researchers have even attempted to recreate the conditions of the farmhouse at night, exploring how moonlight, foliage, and animal behavior might have influenced perception. These reconstructions have provided valuable insight, but have never fully resolved the mystery. The case has also inspired broader scientific and cultural inquiry. Psychologists studying mass perception and collective memory have looked at Hopkinsville as an example of how groups process extraordinary events. How could multiple people describe the same strange beings with such consistency if nothing unusual had occurred? Was it a case of shared misperception under stress, or does it point toward a genuine external stimulus? These questions place the Hopkinsville encounter in the realm of psychology, as much as ufology, a bridge between human experience and the unexplained. Today, nearly 70 years later, the story continues to attract new generations of researchers and enthusiasts. Documentaries revisit the farm, scholars publish essays comparing the goblins to folklore and modern alien archetypes, and local tourism thrives on the enduring allure of the mystery. The annual Kelly Little Green Men Days Festival is not only a celebration of folklore, but also a living reminder that the case remains unresolved. Families gather to share stories, vendors sell alien-themed goods, and lectures keep the debate alive. The Sutton farm, once a place of fear, has become a touchstone for wonder. Even in the age of smartphones and satellites, where UFOs are often captured on video, the Hopkinsville case retains its power. Perhaps this is because it resists easy explanation. Many modern sightings can be dismissed as drones, aircraft, or weather phenomena. But in 1955, in a rural Kentucky farmhouse, a family faced hours of unrelenting strangeness that has yet to be fully explained. Whether one believes they saw owls, goblins, aliens, or something beyond categories, the persistence of the story speaks to its depth. For believers, the Hopkinsville encounter remains among the strongest cases in the UFO record, a multi-witness event with physical interactions, a prolonged timeline, and consistent testimony. For skeptics, it remains a cautionary tale of how fear and folklore can shape perception. For everyone else, it is a reminder of how mystery continues to dwell at the edges of ordinary life. The lasting fascination with the case shows that sometimes stories need not be solved to have meaning. As the years pass and the farmhouse itself fades into history, the legacy of that night lives on in archives, in folklore, and in the imagination of all who hear it. The goblins of Kelly may never be explained, but they endure as symbols of humanity's unending curiosity, figures who remind us that the night sky holds more than stars, and that even in the quiet corners of the world, mystery can descend without warning. As we draw to the end of this long journey into the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter, it is worth pausing to reflect on what this story really tells us. On the surface, it is a tale of a frightened family, a lonely farmhouse, and strange beings in the night. Yet beneath the details, the glowing eyes, the sound of gunfire, the relentless fear, lies something deeper, something that continues to resonate nearly 70 years later. This case is more than an unsolved mystery. It is a mirror held up to the human imagination, to our need for wonder, and to our enduring fascination with the unknown. When the Sutton family sat in their modest farmhouse on that summer evening in 1955, they could not have known that their experience would ripple out into history. They were ordinary people, living ordinary lives, until one night placed them at the center of something extraordinary. Their terror was real, their memories vivid, their conviction unwavering, and whether what they saw were owls, goblins, extraterrestrials, or something we do not yet have words for, the story they lived became part of our collective cultural memory. It is easy to dismiss stories like these as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Skeptics have done so for decades, arguing for owls or hoaxes, for tricks of perception, or shared hysteria. And yet, the mystery persists. If the answer were so simple, Why has the story endured? Why has it inspired generations of researchers, festivals, books, and documentaries? Why do we still, to this day, speak of little green men with a mixture of humor, affection, and wonder? The endurance of the tale suggests that it touches on something deeper than a single night's events. Perhaps the real lesson of Hopkinsville is that mystery itself is valuable. It reminds us that, even in an age of satellites, science, and constant information, there are still edges of experience that cannot be neatly explained. Mystery invites imagination. It allows us to consider possibilities beyond our daily routines, to step into the shoes of a family staring out into the dark, hearing the rustle of unseen visitors, and wondering what might lie beyond the walls of their home. In that sense, the Sutton's fear becomes our wonder. There is also something profoundly human about the way the story has transformed over time. What began as silver goblins became green aliens. What was once ridicule became folklore. And what was once trauma has turned into community celebration. The annual festival in Kelly, with its laughter, music, and glowing alien masks, shows how fear can soften into story, and story into tradition. The Suttons may have been unwilling pioneers of a legend, but the legend itself now belongs to everyone who hears it. That transformation, fear into folklore, folklore into cultural identity, is as mysterious as the creatures themselves. For those who seek the truth of the event, the case remains stubbornly unresolved. There are too many witnesses for it to be dismissed outright, yet too many unanswered questions for it to be confirmed as contact with extraterrestrials. And so it sits, suspended between belief and skepticism, a story that resists closure. Perhaps that is why it is so captivating. A fully solved mystery fades with its solution. An unsolved one lingers, alive in the imagination. As we reflect on the Kelly, Hopkinsville encounter, we are reminded that mysteries need not be solved to matter. They serve a different purpose. They encourage us to look up at the stars and wonder what might be out there. They invite us to examine our own perceptions, to recognize how fear and folklore shape what we see. They ask us to consider that the universe may be larger, stranger, and more surprising than we can fully grasp. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let this story settle gently in your thoughts. Imagine the Kentucky fields under the soft glow of moonlight, the crickets chirping, the farmhouse standing alone at the edge of the woods. Picture the Sutton family, huddled together, watching the windows, listening for the sound of rustling leaves or the scrape of claws on the roof. Feel their hearts race, their breath quicken, their eyes searching the shadows for shapes they could not understand. And then imagine, as the hours stretch into dawn, the silence that follows, the strange beings gone, the mystery unresolved, the world forever changed by one family's night of fear. As you relax deeper into rest, remember that every culture, every generation, has its own stories of the unknown. From ancient fairy tales to modern UFO reports, humans have always sensed that there is more to reality than what we can measure. The Goblins of Hopkinsville are part of that continuum, a modern myth woven into the same fabric as older legends of spirits, tricksters, and star travelers. They remind us that the boundary between myth and reality is not always clear, and that perhaps both serve the same purpose to keep us wondering. And so the story of the Kelly, Hopkinsville encounter comes to rest, not with answers, but with questions. Were the Suttons visited by beings from another world? Did they stumble into an ancient archetype, made flesh for a single night? Or did they misinterpret the natural world in a way that through fear and imagination gave birth to a legend? We cannot say for certain, but what we can say is that the story has endured, that it continues to capture hearts and minds, and that it stands as a reminder that the unknown still waits, quietly, at the edges of our understanding. As you close your eyes now, let that thought comfort you rather than frighten you. The world is full of mysteries, and that is part of its beauty. The night sky stretches endlessly above, filled with stars and possibilities. Somewhere perhaps, answers wait, or perhaps the questions themselves are the gift, guiding us into wonder, keeping alive that part of us that still dares to dream. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you into mystery.